I'm Leanne with Personality Blocks, and today's video is my first video in my leadership series where I will be talking about different personality types and preferences and how tips for how these types can be better leaders. So today I'm going to be talking about tips for sensing personality types in the Myers Briggs system who are leading intuitive types. So first things first, I want to get into what is sensing for those of you who may not be familiar. In your MBTI code, that's the 4-letter code that makes up an MBTI type, it indicates in the second position whether or not you prefer a sensing or intuitive preference based on the S or the N. If you're an S, you're a sensing preference. What this means is that you primarily rely upon concrete data from your 5 senses or the sensory realm in order to make to perceive how you interact with the world. Some terms that you might think of when you think of a sensing perceiving style would be phrases like tried and true or experiential. So basically anything that can be derived as factual information from the 5 senses. That is one style of perceiving in the MBTI system, and then the other style of perceiving is the intuitive perceiving process, which primarily relies on seeing what's behind the scenes, and that includes seeing patterns as well as making inferences and making connections between two different things, whether it be abstract or concrete, finding ways to tie in information and projecting and abstracting from information what could be a expression that could be used to describe the intuitive preference would be reading between the lines. You've probably heard that before, and that could describe someone who's using an intuitive preference. So the question is when a sensor is in a leadership position over an intuitive, what is important for this person to know in order to be at their best level of compatibility? So I'm going to give a few tips that should help that sensor to interact better with an intuitive person with an intuitive preference. So my first suggestion is to make space to consider new or novel approaches that hold some unknowns. So this includes being open to an intuitive who perhaps you trust to project into the future to see something that you may not necessarily see from the facts that are in front of you. For instance, they might say, hey, if we keep doing this particular thing, then it's likely, like for instance, if we keep not treating our employees with fairness, then there's a likelihood that people are going to become dissatisfied and disengaged with the work. So that's an example of like pulling an intuitive inference off of seeing like if this continues, if this kind of behavior continues, then this is what could happen. And this could happen with, this could happen in a more concrete or in a more looking at different types of information, not just human interactions. So that's the number one tip that I would give a sensor who's leading an intuitive type. Another tip that I think is very important that I would give to a sensor who's leading an intuitive type is to observe context when considering whether or not to try something new. So say your intuitive employee comes to you and say, says, I have this great idea of this new thing we could try, and then you said, well, we've done that before and it didn't really work. So when you say we've done that before and it didn't really work, when looking at the context of the situation that you're in currently, is the context the same, or has it changed from when you first, when the first didn't work? So a lot of situations are context dependent. So it's important that before you write off whether or not something would be successful, to observe the context and see if whether or not things have remained the same. So that's another piece of advice. Another thing I would say is when observing behaviors of intuitives in your team, don't always assume that it's a one-to-one correlation between behavior and a situation that you see. So for instance, this is actually inspired from the book Type Talk at Work, which is a really excellent book about personality, and it covers a lot of different ideas and concepts about how to work with personality, teams, and leadership in the workplace. But basically they talk about how one of the things that people with a sensory style may do with it when leading someone with an intuitive style is to see a person behaving in a specific way and make assumption or decide that it's most likely that this person, for instance, if this person is on their computer and they're on Facebook or they're on some other internet site while they're in a meeting, that they don't care about the job or the project that you're working on. But that isn't necessarily the case. There may be something bigger going on in that situation that's worth looking at. And it may be that the team is not unified under a vision, that they don't see why. The why is very important for intuitives to know why they're doing what they're doing. So it may be important to go back over the mission statements and say, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And to reinforce that and come together as a team. So it's very, very important to do that. It also could be that perhaps your team you're not making, or your team has not been adequately put into the best roles for them. And it may be worth, asking, hey, what are you passionate about? What does get you excited? What can we do to make it so you're more engaged in what we're doing? Because it's really important to me that you're engaged. And of course, I'm going to give the disclaimer that of course there are people who do slack and there are people who may take advantage. And I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people who have a track record of being good, reliable employees and are falling off or disengaging. And then it's important to kind of think of the reasons why that might be. Another thing that actually I was talking with my significant other earlier about this, and he's a sensor, and I'm an intuitive, and he said, I always thought, like, when you go into your head that it's because you aren't interested in what I have to say. That's another thing is, like, intuitives do tend to go, you might see them, like, zone out, per se, or they're going in their head. A lot of times, at least for me specifically, it's a creative, I'm getting inside my creative space, I'm trying to figure out the answers to problems, and that's where I kind of go when I'm doing that. It may look like I'm not engaging, but really I'm in my head and I'm figuring stuff out that way. So that's really important to recognize, and that kind of coincides with my final point, which is just give space to intuitives to brainstorm and to create, and let them take initiatives and share ideas. You may not agree with every single idea that they come up with, but just really, I mean, like with anyone, just letting them be heard and letting their voice be heard and say, hey, that's an interesting idea, or maybe it doesn't fit 100% what you're trying to do. So you can just, maybe you can find take parts of that idea and make it work, So just really making the intuitive feel heard and like their voices, their contributions are valuable in the workplace. So thank you for tuning in to video 1 of the Personality Blocks Leadership series. I hope you really enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you and your comments, and I hope you have a wonderful week.